Okay, I think we're all set. First of all, I'd like to thank you all for the opportunity to present this, what I intend to be a short lecture. I mean, I have some neat systems that I would like to show you the application of some of the techniques I'm going to show from ab initio molecular dynamics, but I intended to devise the presentation as a kind of a teaching lecture because there are so many techniques now that you can use to perform ab initio molecular dynamics, and probably Diego has covered some key aspects about Bohr-Oppenheimer that are really interesting that we use all the time, either because of the computational resources or any other reason. But talk about time. You know, I'm presenting this now that you're probably already tired and going to lunch, but I promise you it won't take too long. And in the end, I have a neat system that we can discuss. I have just a few results so far, and one of the works is already submitted, but we can see some extensions of these technique. So the intention is really to discuss some of the techniques. So there are a lot of formulas that I put here just to remember the main assumptions of each method that we use and how is it suited to study each class of problems. But probably after all this workshop, I don't know if I should ask again, why MD? Why do molecular dynamics? So if we remember from basic physics or mechanics, we know that if we know the potential energy surface, you know exactly you have to establish some boundary conditions, of course, but you know where the system is going, where it's going to evolve. And if you have the configurations that are accessible to the system, and maybe even the ones that are not accessible, but you have the energy, then you can calculate, can do perform statistics over the results and calculate relevant properties. So not only the thermodynamic relevant quantities that I mentioned last, such as the energetic barriers and such, but the problem is, how do we calculate this surface? How do we obtain this surface? As I told you, I have several formulas here that just to show us how can we use these tools to study some which tools should we choose to study each class of problems that I'm going to show. So we start here with just yet again the time-dependent Schrödinger equation, written in the form that you not necessarily factorize the wave function, but you just show the operator with the time dependence here related to the Hamiltonian, so nothing too complicated. And here I just show yet again the standard molecular Hamiltonian. So you have the basics, kinetic energy of the electrons and the nuclei, and the electrostatic interaction, electron-electron, electron-nuclei, and nuclei-nuclei. So we know that are some approaches that we can use here to factorize the solution, or I'm not even talking about putting extra terms here to include perturbations and such. We'll get there, but it's interesting that some of the main books and works still do sometimes, how do you derive the classical dynamics from this equation that I showed you. So usually you start with the ansatz. Probably you've ever heard of that word, what it means. You have a guess for the solution, factorizable form here, not exactly just as the Bohr-Oppenheimer one. We'll get there also. But usually when you write this, you can get to the equations of classical molecular dynamics again, just rewriting the nuclear wave function as just an expression of phase and an amplitude, which would represent the localization of a given entity. If you have a particle, for example, this would have a form of a peak-shaped function that you can associate with the particle. And when you do so, if you substitute this ansatz there and you take the classical limit, you find exactly what we see in basic classical mechanics, which probably you might have seen in the workshop as well. You have the Newtonian equation of motion, but related to the gradient of the expectation value of the energy, which is really important to keep that in mind, because there are several ways to calculate this gradient, and this is the part where things get fun, but also difficult to simulate. So this is just the, as we calculate the forces, classically it's just the gradient related to the position of the nuclei of the potential energy expression. When you use the Born-Oppenheimer separation, then you factorize your solution in terms of the a given set, a complete set of eigenfunctions, and you write the Lagrangian of this expression. If you apply the Euler-Lagrange equations, then you can see that we can split this in time evolution equations, that form that we try to avoid, but is a complete one, where you have the evolution of each, even after this factorization, you have the evolution of each species, molecular, electronic, and the nuclei, each one evolving under the potential created by the other. So this would be, still would be Born-Oppenheimer separation. So it would be a factorizable form of this equation. So still requires an ansatz. So in the case of Born-Oppenheimer molecular dynamics, if we, the main thing that we use here to get to the regular Born-Oppenheimer molecular dynamics is that, as I told you, we calculate this gradient of the energy, but the way you obtain this energy is different than the other method. So what do we do in practice? After you separate the equations, you have an equation for evolution of the coordinates, but you don't have an equation for the evolution of the electron equation. So what you do is that in each step of the molecular dynamics, you just use the self-consistency to get the lowest energy wave function, and then with that you calculate the expected value of this, apart from doing other assumptions. But it's really important to keep in mind that you still have some diagonal terms that if you discard, then you have the adiabatic Born-Oppenheimer molecular dynamics. Because there's a lot of confusion when people say, if you do BOMD, it's necessarily a diabatic, which is not true. I mean, after another approximation, then you might have the adiabatic molecular dynamics. And you'll get a bit more what it means, because the application I intend to show you, it's pretty much on that direction. What do you do when you cannot perform regular adiabatic molecular dynamics? So the first part is that you have to calculate the forces, and to calculate the forces, you have to apply the gradient to that expression. And after that, we can use just any integration scheme, either fixing the temperature or the pressure or whatever. But the problem is here, essentially. And when you obtain these forces, then you can perform dynamics. Actually, at least in the nuclei, the way we're seeing. I mean, we're not saying anything about the time evolution of the electronic part. But if we calculate this gradient, in some situations when you have complete sets, the set that originates the solution for the expression of the exact wave function, then we can see that these two terms vanish, and then you have just this expression. So the force would be just the expected value of the gradient of the Hamiltonian itself. Depending on which way you express this wave function, you have extra difficulties, like when you calculate this gradient, then it doesn't necessarily vanish. Mainly because most of our calculations are not with a complete set, and they are numerical, so it's not always true. You always have to be worried about this when you perform this kind of dynamics. And when you use these functions with an extra dependence on the position, then you have gradients of the wave function as well, which originates the incomplete set forces, so we called, and the second term is our Poulet forces, which usually are present in a class of basis set and not in the other. For example, if you use plane wave basis sets, they are not explicitly dependent on the coordinates. They depend exactly on the wavelength and the k vector. So it makes it incredibly easier to calculate these gradients. As I told you, some of these things might be already known to you, but as I told you, I just thought about devise this presentation as a teaching lecture at this point, so we could discuss even the approximation that I use to solve the problems I intend to solve and show you in the end of the presentation. So there's another alternative that was proposed, that is Carpa-Rinello molecular dynamics. Just out of curiosity, how many of you have heard of this technique before? Just, yeah, okay. Just to know exactly how deep we have to go into. So basically, what we do here is that we have an equation of evolution to the electronic part. But the way it's devised is, okay, same thing as Born-Oppenheimer. You have a Lagrangian, express the energy, and you have the constraints, specifically the orthonormality. And when you apply the Euler-Lagrange equations, is the way to find the equations of motion. This one is not strange compared to the others, but this one is new. So you have an equation for the evolution of the electronic state itself. Can anyone tell why do we do this? I mean, why does the electron have this effective mass here, which is a term that reminds of the, could be compared with the inertia of the electron? Just to know if what I was going to tell you is something new. So essentially we do this because if we use a scheme that we control the energy of the electron here without using SCF schemes, then you can propagate the equations of motion a lot faster. So when you use Born-Oppenheimer, you have to reach self-consistency to get the wave function, then you get the gradients of the energy. When you do Carpa-Rinello, essentially, what you do here is just to keep let's say, isolated the nuclear and electronic degrees of freedom and prevent the exchange of energy between them. So this guy, in principle, by doing this, will remain in the same potential energy surface without doing SCF. So sounds tempting. I mean, is a huge economy if you see the many steps of SCF that you have to do in any calculation. When you do Born-Oppenheimer, seems like a real time saver, but it cannot be applied to any situation, because exactly when you have the nuclear electronic degrees of freedom decoupled by other two, I mean, as I showed you, the constraint and the equation of motion, the role of this structure and the effective mass of the electron is exactly to keep these things decoupled. So if they don't exchange energy, it shouldn't be too far from the potential energy surface, which means in just one step, in each step of the dynamics, you obtain the electronic wave function. And in principle, you can calculate the forces and keep your dynamics going. So, sorry, this just forgot to show. This is just a power spectrum of the phononic and electronic part in a system to show exactly that they differ a lot in energy. So when you are able to do this, you keep these degrees of freedom decoupled. So, but there's a very interesting thing about this that could, in principle, prevent it to be used in systems that would be of interest to us. When you have something like small gaps in a structure or crossing, essentially is the same principle that I showed you before, that would be violated. This no longer would be valid, and then you would have exchanging energy. There would be a guarantee that remain the same surface. And so it cannot be used safely. And there's another course, there's Arhenfest dynamics, which is kind of more, this and just, I'm intending to show you just two of them to compare, but again, just out of curiosity, how many of you have seen or heard of this technique? Yeah, it's a lot harder to come across this, but it's simple to explain why. Because then you come back to the same ansatz that we originated the first equation of motion, and then we see that in this case, we just plug in the time-dependent Schrodinger equation again. But in principle, okay, we take the same limit of h tending to 0, and then we get some equation that looks like the one in the Bohr-Oppenheimer approach. But the problem is now we have an equation for time evolution of the electron also. But when you do this, you do it as a mean field approach. So what happens is that even if you are able to simulate other electronic surfaces to predict transitions between different PES, in this case, your solution is going to be expressed as a linear combination of these states. This causes a lot of problems, especially in the systems I'm interested in, which are essentially two. One of them is more critical than the other, which are charge transfer systems, where if you see, for example, when you say, for example, going to treat polar ion charge transport, the one you have a deformation that you have a coupling with the nuclear part and the electronic part in transport. You have a deformation of the lattice when you have the charge. The problem is that when you use this approach, the description gets worse with time, because it has the tendency of, since you're going to use the linear combination of many wave functions as dynamics evolve, things tend to be more delocalized as they should be. This is not a DFT problem. This is a problem of the approach, which in principle predicts non-adiabatic transitions. Transitions that occur in different potential energy surfaces that are non-crossing in principle, but with this problem. And if things get delocalized, it starts to drain a lot of energy from the reservoir, especially from the nuclei. And in principle, the conductance, the ability to transport charge of your system increases in time, which is not exactly the case in the dynamics. We see kind of we lose the part of the dissipation that is so important to describe the effective mass of the charged species and the dynamics. Still promising if the transport is ultra fast, because if there is such a problem, then why we use it? In some cases, the time scale, the phenomenon is really small, so you can see a lot of things using this approach, but at least you would predict non-adiabatic transitions. I didn't show here because it was not exactly my work, and but I thought it was an interesting discussion. I saw this when I was collaborating with some people at the IBM in Switzerland. They were trying to solve some of the equations for carbon-based systems that sometimes you saw some people here simulating in a variety of ways in molecular dynamics and Bohr-Oppenheimer and such. But they had an interesting problem. So they had a way to test how to fabricate graphene in a cheaper way. So they did this just getting a fullerene ball, for example, and hitting with pretty much like I'm saying, hitting against the wall with a lot of strength and see it open. And it would open, it's just a graphene sheet. And people started to simulate this with the regular techniques, and they would never see this opening. Because in graphene, you have many, many crossings, especially singlet, triplet crossings that you have from delocalization when you bend graphene. So this is a kind of thing that you have to use dynamics very carefully. When you use this approach, of course, they had to use massive resources of computing, but they could see in a non-adiabatic description the opening of the fullerene. So in that case, it was not, they didn't see this just because the experiment told them it was true. I mean, because there was a failure in the description. And this is something that could happen to all of us who are trying to do ab initio molecular dynamics. Because we always assume that we are in a BO surface, and that's okay. But as I told you, in problems that you have many different electronic states depending on the coordinates or charge transfer problems, this is not always true. There's another option, which is a trajectory surface hopping, just to solve the problem that Arhenfest introduces, trying to do something that makes the electron to stay in just one state. And this is, again, there's an expansion very that resembles a lot the ones I showed you before. But if you, again, replace the wave function with time-dependent amplitudes, like you were localizing a particle, and again, you get the classical limit, but from other way, what happens is that you get an equation of motion that in principle you can have the hopping of the state J to the state I. So in the middle of the dynamics, what happens is that suddenly you are in a PAS, and then you use a statistical approach to say, okay, there's a probability now that I'm going to switch to the other surface. So your system remains always in one surface. And of course, we solve one problem, introduce a lot more. Because in some cases, you have problem with the coherence of the system, especially in phases where you have these jumps. It's always a problem with the description of things that change very quickly. But especially beyond the problem of the decoherence is you see sometimes unavoided crossings. So a thing that you might know is that when you have a degenerate system, but they're coupled, you never have a crossing, at least in diatomic molecules that you have just a smaller number of degrees of freedom. So you always have a correction. If they are coupled, you have an avoided crossing that changes the eigenvalues and they remain in different surfaces, which is the main problem when you have non-adiabatic transitions. Well, but enough of the theory, because I told you I could speak a lot more about these techniques. I think it's not the idea. We could do a whole school out of this. It would be interesting because we can cover many interesting phenomena like in photochemistry, in excited state dynamics, and many of the things which I'm also interested, but it's kind of a recent line of research in the group, so I don't have a lot to show you right now, but hopefully soon I will. So, but this case is an interesting case that I came across when I was at the university that I worked at. I saw many experimentalist people trying to find theoretical solutions to their problems. Sometimes not exactly knowing what they wanted to find, but there's a technique called electrochemical impedance spectroscopy that is well known to the people of physical chemistry. You can see a lot of details in nanostructured systems in the vicinity of electrodes. Especially when you have this as compact as it could be, it behaves like a capacitor. When you have charge separation, you can calculate electric properties in here. Why is so interesting and so appealing? Because when you have this structure, you have kind of a 2D material in contact with an electrode, which in principle, if you can regulate the distance between them, you can tune the properties much easier than any other methods you would have specific techniques of fabrication, or it would be too difficult to have this kind of thing. But this thing is not exactly a capacitor anymore. If you attach this red dot here, represents just a redox group. What is a redox group? It's a group that in principle can just undergo oxidation or reduction. It could change its number of electrons. It would be what we call a Faradaic process. So this thing really changes or could change the charge depending on what you do to the electrode. Apart from what's going on here, so why this would be a good sensor? Because in principle, the properties of these, this redox switch would change with environment. So imagine that you have soon I will say that this red dot is ferrocene that I'm interested, but okay, we can just get this a bit ahead. But imagine what happens when you have, for example, a protein around this environment. If you have something of a given charge, for example, say that is positively charged, if you put this in contact with the redox part, it's going to be there is going to be an effect on how difficult it is to put a charge in this group, or if it's negative. But what is more fun here is that if it was a problem of just positive and negative, we would say a lot more about what's going on in the vicinity of the redox group. The fun thing is that proteins are big molecules. They have a signature of charge. You cannot just classify them as positive or negative. They have a charge distribution. And when you put over many units, there's going to be a local effect different on each unit, and an effect on each unit on itself. So really originating just a fingerprint of distributions. What as a step 0, we could see this with QMMM and just an electronic structure calculation to see how these states are. Actually, we have a work submitted on that, and soon I'll tell you guys how it went. But we found very interesting things that we can see a selective change in the density of states of these guys, depending on what we put over this monolayer. But where the dynamics get here? In principle, here is just to show you how, in another work, how these effects were first seen in that kind of system. So now our red dot has a name. Is this just this group attached to bigger molecules, inorganic molecules, very simple 1-aliphatic carbon molecules at the gold surface. So we're trying to see the process that happens when we put something here above the centers, what happens to the communication with the metal, but in terms of electron transfer. And then we see in this work, it was interesting to see there was an effect of the environment, because if you change the solvent, can you tell what we're changing here in this particular solvents that we put here? So you have a dichloromethane, you have acetonitrile and water. So we change in some extremes of a dielectric constant. And in principle, it's a simple way to start changing the environment here and understand what goes on. And we see the capacitance changes because, of course, when you charge one group, it's difficult to charge the other that is around it. But this behavior also changes with the solvent. So again, you could say this because the screening of this charge changes, so does the energy. And then we see this in the capacitance. But we see different fingerprints in here when we put more complex things. This is the first way there was the effect was seen that the electrostatics could, the environment electrostatics could affect this communication. So this is the system we're simulating. Of course, we had to do a classical MD before we do anything to understand the structure of this. So this is the alkyl part, just without the hydrogens and the ferrocene molecules, surrounded by water attached to gold. And you could say, how I'm going to simulate anything quantum on this? It's out of the scope of the talk, but we use a lot of QMMM here. So we can separate some of the effects as a classical potential coming from the point charges that we have from MM. So this is why we have to have a force field here first. In order to do QMMM, you have to know how to describe the MM part, which is usually described by partial charges regarding the long range interactions. And this is all contained in the force field. But what was interesting is that we were able to calculate, and this comes the story of the dynamics, finally. So for not making all my talk just useless for this line of thought. And what happens here is that we tried to do a titration of one of those ferrocenes in the monolayer to see what was happening. And it's interesting here, I'm just showing what happens in the monolayer. But if you titrate these things in water, and what is, I'm going to explain what is this graph. But if you titrate the separate ferrocene molecule in solution, for example, they say it follows Marcus' theory. And again, I could give a talk just about that, but just to put the main assumptions, you have a state, two states of charge, and the energy reorganization, the energy that costs for you to get the solvent reorganized to get the transfer from one unit to the other is essentially the same in the reduced and the oxidized state. So, but what happens if you put this in a monolayer? In a monolayer, the environment is not isotropic anymore. So you have the monolayer, you have the organic part, you have solvent, you have counterions, and you have the analyte you're going to try to detect. So what we do here is essentially one thing. To get these curves, it kind of looks like a crossing between two potential energy surfaces. But the reaction coordinate here I'm sorry, the legend here didn't show what was this. But there was this assumption that one general reaction coordinate that we can use for the system is exactly the energy needed for reduction and oxidation. So these two curves are distributions of energy gaps that you get to transform reduced in oxidized state and vice versa. So what we do to obtain these curves, we do two molecular dynamic simulations. At the time, Bohr Oppenheimer. One, when the ferrocene is reduced, and the other one is oxidized. So when you are in each state, then you can calculate the energy to go to the other state. Just like Marcus' theory. You start in one part, you just get a vertical energy to get to the other part. But the problem is the crossing. In principle, if you have the crossing, you cannot use Bohr Oppenheimer MD. So why did we use it? Because if we know that it follows Marcus' theory, at least to get the delta G, we can just sample this region and interpolate the graphs with two parabolas. And why parabolas? Because in Marcus' theory, you assume that the response of the solvent is linear with the, it's quadratic with electric field, but it's linear in energy. And when you do that, so these things should follow a Gaussian distribution in thermodynamic equilibrium. But when you calculate the free energy of something that you have the partition function depending on quadratic thing like a Gaussian, the partition function some kind of is the logarithm of this distribution. So what you have when you have the logarithm of a Gaussian, then you have a parabola. That is why you can describe this kind of phenomena. Now this is well, here I have the legend, but here is the free energy, and this is the gap of the potential energy. Instead of using a complicated collective coordinate like the work in Diego was showing, I mean, it would be nice if we could show more collective coordinates. We're just working on that. But as a start, if you want to describe just these properties, you might start with the energy required to get to the other configuration. At least you're going to see basic kinetic properties, and the most important thing that we are using here as something that supports the sensor, which is the reorganization energy. And this is something that we can also measure, and we do not need to describe what happens in the crossing. But of course, if we want to get the kinetics, then we'll have to describe this a little better, which also we have other approaches that we can go before going to RHEMFAST or other complicated MD schemes. But in this case, we found something that is really interesting. So there's a difference between the reorganization of the neutral species and the charged species because of the anisotropic region. And that's what makes the sensor so interesting. That's what makes it appear some of the fingerprints that I told you that it could appear in the capacitance. And another work that we are currently investigating is just what happens in the charge transfer in proteins, just as a source of inspiration, which is there's so many in biology. This is a protein that I studied in the recent past. I mean, we started moving from it because it's so complicated to manipulate. We just want to understand nature to try to mimic with less effort. So we are investigating here exactly what happens, how these things could be transfer charge so efficiently, because in the literature it's still proposed that there are some proteins that are better than wires, metallic wires. In an environment that you don't have any sheeting of your material, you don't have any protection, and you have many counterions. Usually these things are in soil with water and so many other things that could hinder the transfer. So we're trying to investigate why it's so efficient. In this first work, we're just established the structure of the protein. So here, no MD, not even ab initio MD. But this is the possibility that we are investigating. These red parts, they bind to metals. So this protein, in principle, is used to bioremediation. Bacteria, these bacteria use metals the way we use oxygen. So it's a final destination to the electrons that we generate in respiration. But it has to be quickly because bacteria has metabolic needs that have to be supplied at the time the bacteria needs energy. So, and still with some engineering here, we were able to reach at smaller proteins with very simple ingredients that we mimic some of these properties that it has. So still efficient, but not so complicated. Because bacteria does not have a chemical lab to synthesize something more, well, it kind of does. I mean, the biochemical machinery sometimes is even better than ours, but we don't have the control we have in the chemical lab, for example, sometimes. So what happens is that these structures would be like the lung of the bacteria. And it was named because it binds to metals to do the metabolism. It was called iron lung. So, because it would be a part of this oxidation reduction process. But what we're doing now, and sorry, I'm not going to show you a lot here because the dynamics are really slow and take a lot of time. But what we're doing here now is just to try to understand in just a piece of the protein and two metals, which is just depicted here very simply. These are complex in some other part of here that I'm not showing. But in here we have a basics of what we use for electron transfer, which is an electric field coming from a given conformation of an alpha helix and some aromatic residues, which in principle provide some of the delocalization pretty much like polarons and other conducting systems. So what we're doing is that we start our configuration concentrating the charge here, either choosing the coefficients of the wave function or using the potential. And then we do dynamics to see if we could be ultra fast, because the problem in these biological systems is to generate the charge. Transporting it is not exactly the problem. So that's the part we're learning a lot, but slowly, because these dynamics are really costly. So, okay, this is what I intended to show. I have some more data, but the other work is submitted and I just couldn't find the geometric descriptors like the nice ones that Diego showed, like the radial distribution functions and other interesting things that you get from the dynamics. But in principle, this is where we are using non-adiabatic dynamics is really important, but really hard to do these days. There are some softwares that advanced a lot, and some of the techniques I tried just to show very briefly some of them to you and the potential application. So thank you very much, and I'm open to any questions you have. Thank you.